If you're planning to purchase a home in BC, there's a few important dates throughout the real estate transaction that you need to be made aware of and completely understand. And this is extremely important if you have something to sell in order to make your next purchase. Because if you get this wrong, it could end up costing you a lot of money. Or potentially even worse, being stuck in between houses and having to sleep in your car. And nobody wants that. So that's why in this video, I'm gonna be covering all the important dates and times within a real estate transaction here in BC. So let's get right into it. So when you're writing an offer, there are 6 important dates that you need to pay attention to, and now there's actually gonna be a bonus too, which I'll cover at the end. So first of all, we're gonna focus on the dates that are the most immediate. These are gonna consist of your offer date, your offer expiration date, and your subject removal date. So your offer date is the actual date when you're officially making that first offer to purchase a property. So regardless of how many times the contract goes back and forth, whether it takes 1, 2, 3 days, or even potentially a week, your offer date will stay the same. To make it very simple, it marks the beginning of the negotiation process between the buyer and the seller. And there are other forms throughout the transaction that you'll have to include this offer date on, such as any addendums or the subject removal. So it's important just to be aware of it and keep it in mind. Next is the offer expiration date. This is the original deadline by which the seller must respond to the buyer's offer. And conversely, if there's another counteroffer from the seller back to the buyer, this date and time is still in play. So originally, the buyer sets this date to create a sense of urgency and prompt a timely response from the seller. So it can become part of your negotiation strategy because obviously you don't want to leave it open for too long because that gives other parties more of an opportunity to come in and write an offer as well. However, you also want to leave enough time for the sellers and their agent to be able to actually go through the contract and either sign off on it or counter you. So every situation is a little bit different, but this is a conversation you need to be having with your agent, and it's going to play a role in the negotiation process. So when the buyer sends it over to the seller, if the seller doesn't accept, counter, or reject the offer by this date and time, the offer then expires and is no longer legally binding, which frees the buyer to pursue other properties. And if the offer has gone past this time and the other agent or your agent tries to counter it and say that it becomes a new offer, this just isn't correct. It needs to be done before that expiry time. And then on to our next important date, it is subject removal. But realistically, subject removal doesn't really come into play until you've got the accepted offer, so make sure you have that in play first. So as you may or may not be aware, the majority of offers are made subject to certain conditions or subjects that must be fulfilled by the end of the subject removal date. These are typically things such as subject to financing, subject to home inspection, subject to reviewing and approving the property disclosure statement as well as the title, and subject to obtaining home and fire insurance at a reasonable rate. There are dozens of other subjects that can be added to the contract. However, these are going to be what I consider your big 5 outside of strata documents if it is a strata property. Now, this subject removal date is the deadline, as I mentioned, that all these conditions must be satisfied and removed by the buyer. So in order to remove these subjects, there is a separate form, a subject removal form, that the buyer must sign off on. If the buyer is unable to remove their subjects by this date and there's no extension granted, this means that the deal will be dead. And something I also want to mention is that generally here in my real estate market, the Fraser Valley as well as the greater Vancouver area, typically the deposit is going to be due within 24 hours of the subject removal, sometimes upon subject removal. However, I know this differs in other markets, so it's just something to keep in mind. So that's it for the 3 initial dates, and now we'll move on to the 3 remaining ones. So the 3 remaining dates are going to be completion, possession, and adjustment date. So let's start it off with the completion date. This is when the actual legal transfer of property ownership occurs. So essentially when the buyer's name is put on title. On this day, all the necessary legal and financial paperwork is finalized and the sales proceeds are transferred from the buyer to the seller through their respective legal representatives. The completion date is crucial because it signifies the official change of ownership as recorded in the land title office. And just to give you an idea, the time frame is typically about 60 to 90 days from offer acceptance until completion. However, there is no mandatory time frame. But what I will mention is that 30 days or less is extremely quick, and lawyers and mortgage brokers really don't like this. I think one of the quickest closings I've ever personally done was about 3 weeks. weeks, and that was because it was a vacant property and we had all our ducks in a row. But in general, you really don't want to be shorter than 30 days. Conversely, it would be considered a long closing if it was 120 days or more. Now, one of the potential issues with having such a long completion date is the fact that most mortgage pre-approvals only last 120 days. And so if there was any level of uncertainty with your financing, or you were cutting it close already and there's a change in interest rates, you may no longer qualify. So this is just something to keep in mind, and definitely a conversation to be having with your real estate agent and your mortgage broker. Something else I want to mention here is that your completion is always going to come before your possession. Now, technically they could happen on the same day. I know that this is common practice in some other provinces. However, here, usually they're at least one day apart. But regardless of that, one thing I will advise you is to avoid Fridays for completions. And the reason for this is that if there are any issues, God forbid, that do come up on the Friday and you're not able to deal with them by the end of the day, it's going to push you into Monday, because none of the lawyers' offices work on the weekends, as well as the land titles office. So please try and avoid this as much as possible. I just won't let my clients do it unless it's an absolute must. And lastly, as a buyer, you need to make sure your home is insured as of this date. So if you're purchasing something and you have your completion on February 18th and your possession on February 22nd, you need to make sure the home is insured from the 18th. The reason being is that as of completion date, that is when you legally become the owner. And if anything was to happen between completion and possession and you weren't insured, and the seller wasn't insured, which you don't want to take the chance on regardless, you just don't want to get yourself into that situation. Now, moving on to our next date, this is going to be possession. So this is a date when the buyer is actually entitled to take physical possession of the property. So basically, this is when we're able to hand over the keys. And so in general, I would say it happens anywhere from 1 to 5 days after the completion date. However, it can be longer. Now, the reason being is that we need to allow time for all the financial transactions to clear and for the seller to move out. So on the possession date, the buyer typically receives the keys to the property, and that's when they can start moving in. Now, from my understanding, in certain provinces like Alberta, the completion and possession dates typically actually happen on the same day. So when I have had clients from there and they're not familiar with this process, it makes them a little bit uneasy, because technically you've actually become the owner prior to actually getting possession of the property. And I can completely understand where people are coming from with this concern, because technically the seller is still in your house. But trust me, this is how it is. Speak to any lawyer, and it's just the way things are done here. Now, if you're both selling a property and buying one, typically you're going to need a little bit more time between your completion and possession dates. The reason being is that there's a bit of a domino effect, and you're going to have multiple properties, both yourself, the buyers, and the sellers of the other property, all having to try and make these dates work. So ideally what's going to happen is you're going to first close your sale, and then the following day potentially you're going to close your buy. And then the day after that, the sellers will close their buy. The following day, you will get your new keys, and then the day after that, you will give your old keys. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't always work out to be as perfect as this. There are so many moving parts in a real estate transaction, and it really depends on who the buyers are and who the sellers are. But in an ideal world, this is how it goes. So personally, I like to typically have possession on a Friday. Now, the reason being is regardless of if you're actually moving into the property on that Friday or not, you get the keys on that day, and if there is any delays or anything else and you're planning to move on the weekend, then you can deal with it ahead of time. Now again, this really depends. If you have a flexible situation that you're moving from and you have more flexibility, it might not matter that much. But if you have a tight deadline and you're literally moving out of one place and straight into the other one, then this is going to become even more important. Now, as a seller, you're going to want to make sure that you're keeping your insurance through this possession date. So essentially, you want to have an overlap between the buyer and the seller, as the buyer will have their insurance starting on completion and the seller's insurance will stay until the possession date. So just something to note, but it's important, so please keep it in mind. And now moving on to our final date, it is the adjustment date. So the adjustment date is when financial adjustments are made to account for items paid for by the seller, but which the buyer will benefit from after taking possession. So common adjustments include things like property taxes, utility bills, and strata fees if it's applicable. And basically these are prorated based on the possession date, which ensures that each party only pays for their respective period of ownership or responsibility. Basically, it ensures that things are done fairly and the expenses are split evenly. So just for the fun of it and to make things a little bit easier, let's assume that it's a leap year and there are 366 days. If you were to complete on the property on the 183rd day, then you would split the property taxes right down the middle. So don't worry about doing these calculations yourself. The lawyers will take care of this at closing and it will be shown on what is called the statement of adjustments. And the easiest way to kind of think about it is it's kind of like a balance sheet. But that's where this will all be laid out for you to see. And so that's about it for the primary 6 dates. But if you remember at the beginning, I mentioned there are 2 additional dates. And those are going to be in regards to my favorite thing, the rescission period. So get ready to be confused. So if you're not aware, last year in the real estate industry here in BC, the governing body introduced what is known as the buyer's right of rescission. So essentially this is a 3-day period which was put in place to try and remove any sort of buyer's remorse or have people make decisions that they weren't fully comfortable with. And basically with the introduction of this, a true subject-free offer no longer exists. So now all buyers have a 3-day rescission period window in which they can basically back out of the deal for a small penalty. And that penalty is 0.25% of the purchase price, or basically $2,500 on $1 million purchase. And by no means is that a small amount of money. However, in the big scheme of things, it kind of is. But we're not going to get into too many of the specifics behind it. So the 2 dates we need to know here is, first of all, the final acceptance date. And this is a date in which both parties actually sign off on everything. If there's been negotiations, absolutely every change must be initialed by both parties. Because there's also a seller's acceptance date, and that is when you get your first counter or acceptance by the seller, but we're not even going to go there, so don't even pay attention. If you want more information on that, you can check out my previous video that is a comprehensive overview of the contract of purchase and sale. But back to date number 2, which is the date by which the buyer must exercise their rescission right. And this is essentially midnight or 11:59, 3 business days after the final acceptance date. And so just to clarify, if the final acceptance date was on a Tuesday, then the 3-day buyer's rescission period would start the following day on the Wednesday. So we'll go Wednesday, Thursday, and then essentially midnight on Friday, given that none of those days were a holiday. However, here's where it gets a little bit confusing at times, because let's say that final acceptance date was on a Friday. If that's the case, then Saturday doesn't count, Sunday doesn't count, day 1 is on Monday, day 2 is on Tuesday, and day 3 is on Wednesday, and it would go until 11:59 midnight on Wednesday. And so if I haven't confused you enough, what I'm going to tell you now is that if you have subjects on your contract that are longer than 3 days, this is pretty much irrelevant. So hopefully you're nice and confused now. So that's about going to do it for today's video. So hopefully you got some valuable information, even if you were a little bit confused by some of it. And if you're looking to get some more clarity around this and you're considering buying or selling in my markets of Surrey, Langley, and the rest of the Fraser Valley, you can scroll down and click the first link in the description to book a call with me at a time that works best for you. If you enjoyed this video, all I ask is that you hit the thumbs up button so that the algorithm will push it out to more amazing people just like yourself who want to learn more about BC real estate. And if you want to see more videos just like this one, as well as community tours across the Lower Mainland, I suggest you consider subscribing to our channel. Last but not least, I just want to say thank you so much for watching today's video. Make sure you check out another one on our channel before you get out of here, and we'll see you in the next video.